Well, good afternoon, everyone. And let me preface my remarks by adding my thanks to the conveners of this conference, the thanks that have gone before. It's a great privilege to be here present amongst so many distinguished scholars and speakers. And so to porcelain. The products of the Royal Sèvres manufactory are some of the most admired artistic creations associated with the world of the ancien régime French court. Their refined artistry and technical sophistication have made them objects of connoisseurship and collecting from the moment of their creation in the 18th century. But far more than being beautiful examples of the extraordinary achievements of 18th century French ceramic art, the Sèvres porcelain services represented in our exhibition, Versailles, Treasures from the Palace, point to the intimate connection that existed between the porcelain medium and royal power in Ancien Régime France. The ubiquity of porcelain in our lives today, we eat off it daily, it's found in engineering and electronic components, it's essential to our hygiene practices, it's even found in our bodies in the guise of dental fillings. All of this leads us to take this substance somewhat for granted. But European porcelain was far more than a utilitarian material in the 18th century. The medium was highly symbolically charged and functioned as a metaphor for power in the context of the absolutist state. After the discovery of the secret of a true hard-paste porcelain at Dresden in Saxony in 1708, the newly mastered material immediately assumed a vital representative role at the Saxon court. Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, dispatched diplomatic gifts of porcelain produced at his Meissen factory to courts across Europe, demonstrating in the process Saxon cultural and material accomplishment. Other princes scrambled to emulate the Saxon achievement. A porcelain factory became an essential possession for absolute rulers across Europe. In 1758, Herzog Karl Eugen von Württemberg famously wrote in the founding decree of his manufactory at Ludwigsburg, and I quote, "For a prince of my rank, a porcelain factory is an indispensable accompaniment of splendour and magnificence." But the extraordinary expenses involved in porcelain production meant that it was only with extensive state subsidies that these manufactories could continue to function. None of the great 18th century continental porcelain factories, including the Sèvres factory, were truly commercially viable. They were essentially court institutions, departments of the state, and as such, they served the interests of the ruling prince. 18th century European porcelain, I argue, was a part of statecraft. If we turn to the Sèvres wares represented in our exhibition, we may admire the beauties of the individual items of porcelain tableware on display, but we must bear in mind that what we are viewing are but a handful of individual components from what were conceived of as extensive table services. So, for example, the Bleu Céleste ribbon service of 1769 to 70 for Madame du Barry consisted of some 270 components. The Pearls and Cornflowers service of 1781 for Marie Antoinette consisted of 283 components. And the 1784 rich in both colour and gilding service, again for Marie Antoinette, consisted of over 300 components. These grands services were the most ambitious and celebrated of Sèvres productions and a major contributor to the factory's reputation. The scope of such services, with a huge range of specialised vessel types produced in large series, every piece bearing identical forms of decoration, presented enormous technical challenges for the manufactory and contributed, of course, to the equally enormous cost of these wares. Mimi Hellman has acutely observed that the serial nature of much of the Sèvres factory's production, the labour-intensive creation of sets of identical objects, whether garnitures of vases or components of a dinner service, functioned as a statement of calculated excess. evidencing the ability to command a range of resources and production techniques to create these extraordinarily refined and beautiful objects, which were intended for elite delectation and perhaps occasionally use. And when they were put to use, the components of a table service combined to create spectacle as pointedly theatrical as any other manifestation of courtly display. A table set with elements of the cameo service commissioned for Catherine the Great of Russia at 744 pieces, one of the grandest and most expensive services ever created. This service gives a sense of the calculated visual impact of a grand service arrayed for use according to carefully drawn up plans of display, similar to this diagram from Vincent Lachapelle's 1742 manual on the etiquette of grand banquets. The repetition of uniformly decorated porcelain forms expanding across the surface of the tabletop brings to mind the diagrams for battlefield troop dispositions found in contemporaneous military manuals, or even the plans of the Park of Versailles itself, where through architectural embellishment, order and control are established in an outward moving system across the very landscape, all according to the will of the prince. In other words, these porcelain services, their manufacture, their disposition on the tabletop, their display and use, functioned at multiple levels as statements of princely power. But I wish to go one step further than this and suggest that the very material itself here, porcelain, brought to these objects and the ways in which they were used further symbolic expressions of princely power. That porcelain was understood in absolutist court culture of the 18th century as signifying the anointed prince's God-given power over the created world. Now, an association between porcelain and royal authority in France was long-standing and predated by some considerable time the foundation of the Sèvres factory in 1756. Indeed, it is at Versailles during the reign of Louis XIV that we find the first important instance of the power of the king and his political ambitions being expressed through the idea of porcelain. In 1670-71, Louis XIV had a maison de plaisance erected in the park at Versailles at the northern end of the transverse arm of the Grand Canal. Designed by Levaux and François d'Orbay, this small pleasure palace was situated in extensive flower gardens, which gave the complex its original name, the Pavillon de Flore. But very quickly, the pavilion acquired an alternative title, the Trianon de Porcelain. And we see here this pavilion was demolished in 1687, but we see here a reconstruction of the facade of the main pavilion by Zeger and Dams, the architectural historians. This name for the pavilion, Trianon de Porcelain, derived from the predominantly blue and white colour scheme which dominated the decoration of the interiors and parts of the exteriors of the building. Now, contrary to reports in much older literature, the exteriors and roof of the pavilions were not tiled in blue and white ceramics. Instead, both the gambrel roofs and the numerous large vases that we see here on the roof balustrade, as well as the gables of the building, these were covered with blue and white painted lead sheets and copper vase forms. Inside the building, and we see here a fan sheet that is believed to depict Madame de Montespan in the interior of the Trianon. Inside the building, the blue and white colour scheme continued in faience-tiled floors, blue and white mirror frames, furniture, an example here in the collections of the Getty Museum, believed perhaps to have come from the interior of the Trianon, blue and white fabrics, blue and white stucco ornaments, even the window frames were painted with blue and white patterns, as we see depicted here. Interestingly, there is no mention of any Asian porcelain in connection with the building's decoration, and the ceramic tiles employed in its adornment were largely, although not exclusively, produced by French manufacturers. It was instead the blue and white colour scheme, intimately associated in the 17th century with imported Asian porcelain, that lent the pavilion its name. This evocation of the idea of porcelain was no mere decorative whim on Louis XIV's part. The use of porcelain to adorn architectural interior spaces had been pioneered in 17th century Europe by the women of the Dutch House of Orange. The Republic of the United Netherlands enjoyed a virtual monopoly on the importation of Asian commodities, including porcelain, into Europe for much of the 17th century. And Asian porcelain was adopted by the Orange Court as a means of visually representing the mercantile supremacy of the Dutch global trading empire. The porcelain cabinet, created in 1654 by Amalia van Solms Braunfels at Hoostenbosch, adorned with imported lacquer, and her collection of 398 pieces of porcelain, is considered the first porcelain room in Europe. And this fashion for porcelain rooms spread across Europe, promoted by women of the House of Orange, Orange princesses as they married into other princely houses. And we see here an engraving showing the Porcelainzimmer in Schloss Oranienburg, created by Louise Henrietta of Nassau, who married into the house of the Elector of Brandenburg. And a sense of the type of interior we're talking about here is given perhaps by this reconstruction of the 1706 Porcelainzimmer in Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin. The architectural use of porcelain thus came to be emblematic of the power of the Dutch Republic, a power which by the 1670s the French king eyed enviously and plotted to usurp. In the Trianon de Porcelain, despite the absence of real porcelain, Louis XIV nevertheless invoked the idea of porcelain through the blue and white colour scheme, the façon de porcelain decoration, this idea as an expression of Louis's claim to universal dominion and his aspirations to eclipse the Dutch Republic and lay claim to the trade which brought porcelain to Europe. Aspirations which he would begin to pursue in earnest in 1672, a year after the pavilion's completion, with the opening of his Dutch War. So if in the 17th century porcelain symbolised the French king's aspirations to control global trade, this symbolism shifted in the 18th century as the foundation of first the Vincent and then the Sèvres manufactories delivered to the king the power to command porcelain production. The Vincennes factory was founded in 1740 in the Royal Château de Vincennes, east of Paris. Funded by private shareholders, the factory's starting capital also included a personal loan of 10,000 livres from Louis XV's privy purse, clearly indicating the king's personal interest in this enterprise from its very outset. Louis continued to grant the company valuable privileges throughout its early years, conferring on it the exclusive right to produce porcelain in the Saxon style, in other words, competing directly with Meissen, in 1745. A crisis in 1751 saw the king in 1752 subscribe to a quarter of the factory's financial stock, becoming the single largest stockholder. And in 1753, the factory was granted the title Manufacture Royale de Porcelain de France. In 1756, the factory was moved at great expense from its premises at Vincennes to imposing purpose-built premises on the site of the village of Sèvres on the road to Versailles from Paris. So the manufactory was brought much closer to the seat of the king. In 1759, further financial difficulties at the factory saw the king acquire the entire capital stock of the manufactory. Now, this string of financial difficulties that dogged the early history of the Sèvres factory illustrates the point that I made earlier the enterprise's lack of commercial viability. And we should recall that the construction of the factory premises at Sèvres and the King's purchase of the venture outright coincide with the period of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. So making this royal intervention in the factory, in financial terms, quite extravagant seeming. Now, how do we explain such, from a contemporary perspective, skewed seeming priorities on the part of the French monarch? First, we need to take account of the mercantilist model which dominated 18th century economic thought. This taught that there was only a finite amount of wealth in the world for which individual states competed, so that discouraging the purchase of Asian or Saxon porcelain in place of a French product served to preserve France's share of this limited wealth pool. Conversely, selling French porcelain to the rest of the world served to simultaneously enrich France and impoverish foreign states. But beyond this economic imperative, there was a more profound significance to being able to command the production of porcelain. In 18th century Europe, porcelain production continued to be widely framed in conceptual terms as part of that field of natural philosophy known as alchemy. Alchemy encompassed a broad range of laboratory-based procedures, but is best known perhaps today for its pursuit of chrysopoeia, the attempted transmutation of base metals into silver and gold. This alchemical idea of perfecting baser matter informed the pursuit of porcelain production from its beginnings in Europe. The earliest European production of a soft-paste porcelain took place in Florence in 1575 in the context of Grand Duke Francesco de' Medici's programme of alchemical experimentation conducted at the Casino di San Marco. Johann Friedrich Böttger, credited with a key role in the formulation of a true hard-paste porcelain in Dresden in 1708, was a self-identified alchemist held under house arrest by the Saxon elector. Failing to produce gold from base metal, oddly enough, Böttger saved his own life by producing porcelain, white gold, in its stead. In France too, alchemy played an important role in the porcelain industry. Jean Ayeux, chemist and member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, was from 1751 until his death in 1766 the chief technician at the Royal Porcelain Factory, formulating glazes, enamel colours and, importantly, porcelain pastes. As historian of science Lawrence Principe has shown, Ayeux, the so-called father of French industrial chemistry, that's how he's remembered today, actively pursued alchemical and, in particular, chrysopoeic experimentation in privacy throughout his career. The transmutation of raw earth into hard, shining, translucent white porcelain could be understood in the 18th century context as a resounding affirmation of the transmutational goals pursued by alchemy. And the alchemical art had long-standing associations with princely power. The Saxon court, where porcelain is first mastered in Europe, true porcelain, had been a major centre of alchemical experimentation since the 16th century, state-sponsored experimentation. This interest in alchemy was not merely based upon the potential for generating material wealth either. The alchemical transmutation of matter, achieved through the patronage and at the command of an anointed prince, demonstrated the prince's God-granted power over the created world. We should not be surprised then to learn that Louis XV entertained a personal interest in chemistry, engaging in chemical experimentation. And indeed, Madame de Pompadour is reported to have conducted thermal shock experiments upon porcelain bodies in front of a private audience, including the king, in her private apartments. Porcelain then signalled the potential success of alchemical transmutation, a step on the road to achieving the philosopher's stone, which of course itself is described as a pure white material in alchemical literature. And it also served as a physical demonstration of a prince's worldly dominion. A royal porcelain factory enabled Louis XV to command the transformation of French earth into a miraculous, beautiful material that it was at once art and nature. And of course, the extraordinary seeming presence of a royal apartment in the purpose-built Sèvres factory complex indicates clearly the relationship between porcelain production and royal power. The royal presence and porcelain creation are intimately linked architecturally and spatially. And in a building where different parts of the porcelain production and decoration process were purposely spread across 3 floors, the one part of the building that had access to all of the ateliers and studios in the entire building was a private staircase connected to the salon of the king's apartment, giving the monarch private access to the entirety of the porcelain production process, allowing him alone a panoptic oversight of the entire porcelain production process. And to bring us to a conclusion, if porcelain production served as a demonstration of the actuality of anointed monarch's power, then a number of other aspects of the Sèvres factory's activities, which are usually explained in economic terms, take on new significance. The various legal restrictions that prevented other French porcelain factories from engaging in particular types of decoration, producing particular types of porcelain, served then not merely to protect Sèvres' market share, but they served to emphasise the intimate and exclusive connection between French porcelain and royal power. And in the days of the Revolution, in the period of the constitutional monarchy, Louis XVI dedicated 600,000 livres per annum from the civil list granted him by the National Assembly in March 1790 to the upkeep of the Sèvres factory. Now, given the gravity of the political situation and the numerous demands on the king's resources, this support has often been a source of puzzlement. Arguments have been made that the economic advantages of maintaining production of a renowned French luxury export, as well as keeping 200 people in employment during a period of considerable economic disruption, was paramount. But the economic benefits of maintaining an enterprise which simply could not survive without royal financial support were probably negligible. Far more compelling, I would suggest, is the notion that Louis XVI could not countenance his role as king without the Sèvres factory at his command, without the ability to materialise his status as an anointed ruler and thereby command quite literally not just the French but the soil of France itself. Thank you.